Thank you.
We'll see. I don't know. I think I have the same 25 people helping me.
Thought about,
There's like 50 of them.
you know, that sensation of
Well,
when you're standing like
that's
on
kind of
a cliff or in a building,
Yeah, I was
desire
just
to jump in, but you don't want to
wondering
jump
where colors
in.
Well, I don't have that same desire. I do. I'm more like a deep fear of heights kind of
Yeah,
person.
it's not like, it's,
But I see.
a lot of people like talk about that because you know, like my wife and friends who aren't in stunts in any way, out there they don't want
I
to,
would
but there's this
I remember last time, but I did not see
right?
it.
So like, because
I don't even see a red
light
light.
I'm that high, I don't want to. But there's an urge that makes you think, why am I thinking? It's not if that was in any way related to that agency and interest of like, where is this coming from? Why am I thinking? Is my body acting?
And there's definitely a characterization of things like tic disorders that you can be considered like oh, this thing is happening, or like I'm unable to suppress the action after the intention. Where they're sort of being recharacterized as I'm unable to suppress the intention at all. Like in a normal situation, I would be able to.
And I think of that as
And so when the action's finally performed, it isn't quite the intention itself. So there's definitely something.
Well, that's the best thing one can
Your
say,
awareness of intention,
is to not say it.
ability or inability to perform that intention.
It is ambiguous. Even better.
I just figured it might be interesting if there was an actual activation, like the legs or something.
Are we starting? Okay. All right. We're starting now. Thank you. Okay. Our speaker today is Jason Stornelli, who's visiting the Center for Practical Wisdom this week and the coming week. Jason's an associate professor of marketing at the College of Business at Oregon State University. He received his PhD in consumer behavior from the University of Michigan in 2015. And his research is focused on something that probably most of us would not have thought about, but wise consuming, which might seem like oxymoron to some, I suppose. But he's also studying how wisdom can function in the consumption of social media. And I think these issues, both in terms of making wise decisions as a consumer and thinking about social media as a problem of consumption, are interesting, and we'll hear more from Jason today.
Great. Thanks.
Please join me in welcoming Jason Stornelli.
Hi, it's nice to meet everybody. Thanks so much for giving me the chance to share some work with you today. I'm happy to take questions throughout, or I'm happy to take questions at the end, whatever you prefer. But let's start out with a little bit of free association. So let's explore Howard's oxymoron comment for a moment. I'm going to put a word up on the screen in a moment. I want you to do two things. If you have a pen and paper handy. If you don't, you can keep it in your head very easily. So first thing is write down or think about the first kind of word or phrase that enters your head when you see this word. And then secondly, think about the last consumer decision that you made. Okay, let's do a little bit of show and tell. Anybody want to share what their word was that popped into their head when they saw the word consumer?
Bias for some reason.
Bias. Okay. What else? Protection.
Corporations.
Business, corporations. Okay. What else? Person. Okay.
Oh, money.
Money. Okay.
Me.
Me. Ah, interesting. Okay. And what about the last consumer decision that you made?
About coffee.
Coffee. Okay. Coffee. We got a lot. It turns out this is a room of academics. We got a lot of coffee.
Right.
A sandwich.
Not to buy another kilt.
Well, maybe we can explore that one later.
I actually thought of it not, although I thought of business for the first one and my own consumer decision, I just thought of my consuming things, not of buying them.
Ah.
Instead of what I had consumed today, which is
Like lunch?
disjunction. No lunch candy.
That can be lunch.
Halloween lunch.
So that's interesting. So actually, we foreshadowed a couple of things that I was going to pick up on. One is me, right? We're all consumers, all of us. And sometimes consumption gets kind of a negative bent, right? We think about things like materialism or overconsumption or the amount of packaging that we're generating every time we go to the store and buy something. And absolutely, all those things are problems for us to consider and things that detract from well-being. And I think one of the things that my co-authors and I are trying to do is help people to find a balance between kind of underconsumption and overconsumption, getting things kind of just right if we think about the three bears metaphor. And then the second piece that I think is interesting for us to highlight is this idea of, does consumption necessarily have to be about buying stuff? Because really, the consumption that we all engage in every day is typically in terms of supporting some kind of higher order goal that we have, right? Whether that be a functional need to move towards something like completing a paper or whatever, or whether it be a psychological need, right? I buy something in order to try to feel good, or a social type of need, right? I buy something in order to connect with other people. But again, it doesn't have to be about just buying stuff. Right? And there's two words there that I think are instrumental. One is buying. There's all kinds of ways that we can consume things without buying anything, right? We can rent things, we can share things, we can borrow things, acquire them in any number of ways. And there are also a number of decisions in the consumption process that have nothing to do with acquisition, right? About usage decisions, for example. How much should I be on my laptop? Or about decisions to extend the product life of something, or how to dispose of something. And each of those points along the consumption process offers us the opportunity to increase people's well-being and help them to achieve those goals. The second piece doesn't have to be about stuff either. Right? We consume experiences all the time. Think about going on vacation in order to achieve a higher order goal of broadening one's horizons, right? Discovering new cultures. Think about information that we all consume. I thought actually we probably all share a similar last consumption opportunity, which was coming here to this talk, right? And hopefully you emerge thinking that was a good decision. But we have a lot of avenues to promote well-being as people who are concerned about this topic. Right? And so I tend to think about consumption as all we're trying to do is optimize a balance for people between what they get and what they give in order to get that benefit, right? And the benefits could be broadly construed. They could be functional things, but they could be psychological things, they could be social things, they could be physiological, any number of benefits. And that's balanced against cost, which we often think about in terms of money, but cost of time is an important thing, cost of effort. So all I'm trying to do, and my co-authors are trying to do, is help people to achieve that balance. But we have a lot of factors that sometimes work against us.
Get and give, like how much it costs you and how much you get out of it, or?
Yeah, exactly, a balance between benefits and costs. So what I get from that consumption experience, what benefits do I derive, and what do I have to give up in order to get that?
Why do you want a balance?
Maybe expand on that a little bit.
Why not just increase how much you get compared to how much you give?
Interesting. So I agree from a consumer's perspective, that is optimal, right? We want to try to minimize the amount of costs while maximizing the number of, or the amount of benefits that we get. And so we could think about it that way. And maybe balance isn't necessarily the best word to use. Maybe we could think about trade-offs as another potential word to use. But I picked balance because I think it fits nicely with some of the wisdom metaphors that we'll talk about. But you're right, we're trying to optimize, maybe a better word, the interplay between benefits and costs. And so, you know, there are barriers that stand in the way of maximizing well-being. Things like an unlimited amount of products and information that is constantly streaming at us at all times. Things like messages that come to us over the internet that are micro-targeted, that are intended to kind of speak to the core parts of the self and that often cause deep-seated emotions to arise. the lure of credit and debt that sometimes is difficult for people to manage, and the environmental impact that our daily choices have. And so I think about wisdom as a way for us potentially to help guide people in terms of optimizing the interplay between benefits and costs, or achieving a balance between them. And so I'll share with you a couple of projects, one empirical and two that are conceptual, that I hope will spark kind of opportunities for us to talk about potential future empirical research opportunities. And so let's start a little bit by talking briefly about wisdom. And I don't have to give a primer to the folks in this room about wisdom, but I think it's helpful given kind of the diversity of definitions and ways of thinking about wisdom that are out there, that I kind of lay out how we've been thinking about it, and that way we kind of see if we're on the same page. So I tend to start with this Aristotelian idea of phronesis, right? Practical wisdom. And really that's about recognizing essential elements of a situation and responding in a fitting way. Right? And part of that involves skill, right? What Aristotle calls techne. In other words, knowing how to get from point A to point B. But part of it also involves morality, right? Thinking about how do I know which goals to pursue, and how do I choose those in a positive way. And that mix of morality and skill is really built through experience. Right? It comes from encountering a situation, acting, receiving feedback, adjusting, and then hopefully developing habits over time that lead to eudaimonia, right? That lead to flourishing and that lead to well-being. And a number of modern definitions of wisdom have kind of emerged over time. We think about the work by Baltas and colleagues, or the balance metaphor by Sternberg, any number of definitions. And here are some kind of themes that have come out of that. Things like integration of values and goals and behavior, or metacognition, or kind of prosociality as a key part. But some of those factors, I think, fit really well with the consumption process, and some of them maybe fit a little bit less well. It's hard maybe to see how spirituality or sense of humor, those are two things that came out of the Bang and Meek's ingestive paper, review paper, how those fit with the consumption experience. And so I want to share with you a scale that my colleagues and friends, Michael Lukes, David Mick, and Kelly Hawes developed to measure the specific experience of wisdom in the consumer domain. And so their scale has 6 dimensions, things like responsibility, how do I preserve an aspired lifestyle, how do I work toward kind of being the type of person that I want to be, purpose, how do I pursue positive experiences, flexibility, am I open to kind of those non-traditional ways of consuming like renting or borrowing, perspective, do my choices reflect a holistic variety of perspectives, reasoning, am I making thoughtful choices, and then kind of sustainability, am I thinking outside myself in terms of others and the environment and community. And I'm happy to send you this paper. This was published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology. I think it's a really useful instrument for measuring behaviors and thoughts and feelings related to wisdom in a consumer context. And it served as the basis for one of the conceptual pieces that I'll talk about, which was published in the Journal of Public Policy and Marketing a few years ago. The idea here is that we all face choices, and we all try to strive toward, or at least some of us, try to strive toward being wiser consumers. But in many ways, our choices are constrained by the availability of alternatives in the marketplace, right? If I want to buy a phone that, for example, maximizes sustainability, doesn't use kind of materials that are scarce, I'm probably going to find it hard to do that because I have no idea how to make a phone, right? I am dependent on what Apple and others want to sell me in the market. And so the idea that we had here is that we need to be having a conversation with entities that do control those types of decisions, firms, policymakers, et cetera, to try to start a broader conversation about enabling wise behavior. And so our research question was about how do and how could practices by marketers and policymakers encourage wise choices on behalf of consumers rather than hindering those. And so we developed a framework to try to look at pitfalls market are engaging in, and recommendations for best practices in order to try to overcome those. And so we built on the scale that I just showed you a moment ago, the consumer wisdom scale. And has anybody ever seen this circular economy framework? So it's a framework that was put out by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And the idea is that resources that are used during the consumption process, whether they be material resources or intellectual resources, ideally they should proceed in a circular route, such that things are not going to the landfill, but at the design stage and at the distribution stage and at the use stage and at the stage where people are disposing of products, we should be thinking of ways to keep materials going in a circular pattern. And it's really kind of a long-term view, right? We're trying to get beyond kind of the momentary experience of consumption and think more broadly. And so at each of those stages, we incorporated elements of the marketing mix, what we call the 4 Ps, price, product, place, and promotion, in order to try to provide concrete steps for firms and policymakers to take. And so this was a conceptual paper. So it was mostly around a literature review. So we identified consumer wisdom pitfalls and best practices from a review of the literature. And then we classified those into a series of themes such that we could make recommendations at each stage of the circular economy framework. And this was our framework, which I'm happy to send you the paper if it's useful. But I thought instead what I would do is go through an example of each one of the stages. So if we think about, for example, designing products or producing them, there, one of the themes that emerged from our lit review was wiser consumers want to engage in prudent reasoning, right? They want to be able to structure the decisions to pursue desired lifestyles. And so products that they have available to them should serve a worthwhile purpose and enable them to make those decisions easily. One way that manufacturers sometimes counteract this is to do things like what happens in the mattress industry. Has anybody ever bought a mattress recently? What was the experience like?
It's just to order online.
It was online, you said? Yeah. Okay. So did you feel prepared in order to make that choice? Or did you just feel kind of like, I'm shooting darts at a dartboard?
Not really prepared. It's just I need it and I have to go.
Okay. Anybody else ever bought a mattress before? What's the experience like?
Well, I got a targeted advertisement
Okay.
telling me about a lovely temperature-controlled mattress. I thought, I'm a hot sleeper.
Okay.
I struggle with temperature in my sleep.
They've convinced you of that.
They convinced me of that. I bought it. Second best thing I own.
Really? Okay.
What's first?
This cat.
A cat.
A cat. Okay.
Who also loves the temperature-controlled
Aha.
mattress.
Aha.
So these are synergistic.
And I mean, your experience is not unusual, right? People are kind of searching for how the hell do I make this decision? Because really, if you went to a store, if you didn't go online, if you went to a store, you're looking at the sea of rectangles, right? Which look relatively similar, and maybe you lie on one and you think, okay, that feels okay, and then you lie on another and you think, oh, I don't know if that really feels much different, right? And so we're searching for some basis upon which we can make an informed decision. And mattress manufacturers actually kind of want this decision to be relatively difficult for you. They do things like put the same components, so springs and foams and all this stuff, in the Sealy, whatever, Cloudmaster 3000 that you get at Macy's, and then you go over to Mattress Firm and it's the Super Comfort 25. Really, those are often the same internal components. They just put a different name and they put a different cover on it so that it's difficult for you to know what in fact you're buying. And that hinders this ability for consumers to engage in prudent reasoning. Right? So one of the recommendations that we made was to think about how can we understand people's critical metrics in the decision, maybe sleeping temperature is one, and how can we provide them with value that is not superficial. So we recommended that marketers do things like engage consumers in product design, and policymakers should support through educational programs.
Jason, I have a question.
Sure.
What's the motivation for the company to do that?
The motivation for the company to do that is often price discrimination. So if I can sell a mattress for $800 to a consumer at Bloomingdale's, and it's really the same mattress that I sell for $500 to a different consumer at Macy's, that enables me to make more money at the end of the day with the same components.
Right, so what's the motivation for the company to then engage with the consumer?
So the argument that, you're exactly right. So the argument that we make in the paper is that we shouldn't be thinking about these types of decisions in terms of immediate transactional relationships, because that's not the way to build loyalty, and that's not the way to build well-being on the basis of consumers. And so ideally we should be taking a perspective that transcends kind of this immediate consumption experience and trying to build relationships, was the argument that we made.
Are there examples of companies that do that successfully? Especially if your mattress example, you're going to buy one maybe every 5 to 10 years.
Yep.
So brand loyalty is not necessarily an imperative. But are there examples of companies that you maybe saw that might be doing some of the things that you're advocating and say they do this well? This is what, maybe not exactly what you're saying, but in that line, and what should be emulated as a real world example?
Nothing comes to mind right off the top of my head, but I think you're right that that is an interesting thing to think about. Does anybody have one that comes to mind?
Some of the companies like Purple and so forth, I think they market themselves as one source and argue for the nature of their reputation. I guess that's what I was thinking also, is that a piece of what you're saying the company should do feeds into an attitude about the company. And so with people who have certain kinds of orientations to be looking for some kind of company to be supportive of, some companies have crafted that kind of image in different kinds of ways, lowering their overhead, et cetera, by putting more into the quality of the materials, not doing the kind of diverse marketing that you're talking about for the same object. And so I think there are a couple of mattress companies actually that are just online that do that kind of thing.
I think Nordstrom kind of comes to mind. They have all those stories of you can return anything, and I've done that. I had a brother rip sleeves off an expensive shirt because he was a teenager, and it's not awesome. But I brought it back in pieces, and no questions asked, gave me a return. So I guess on picking out a suit, which could be expensive, and if you're doing it the first time, you don't know how to make decisions. Having that trust that if I made the wrong decision, I can bring it back, and there will be no questions asked in exchange. So that might be an example.
One thing that I'm concerned about is this only works for producers that have longevity in their business model. So there's certainly all of these companies, I'm thinking the ones we find on Amazon, that they're just trying to make a quick buck.
Sure.
They want to sell and move as much product as possible because this month they're in the mattress business because they're able to buy a little factory that makes these little mattress widgets, and we're buying them, and they're not going to be here later, but they're able to sell at a low cost, and they get a bunch of people to buy these things knowing that we can't return them, and they're probably going to be somewhat defective. Obviously that's a trade relationship between price and quality here, but I'm wondering how do we navigate a world in which that's not always in the producer's model?
Yep. And I would think about that as a strategy that hinders wisdom, right? That hinders people's ability to engage in wiser consumption. And so you're right that these are going to be trade-offs that firms are going to make in terms of longevity, in terms of profitability. And our objective with this paper was to try to start a narrative about maybe we should be thinking about different things than just kind of fly by night, or how do we make as much money as possible in the short term. But that's a persuasion question, right? Are we as academics and our policymakers, government, et cetera, able to persuasively deliver that narrative? And I think that's an open question.
What would it look like for a policy? So you mentioned the policymakers, but what policies would you imagine, especially in American capitalism system, being able to be enacted to encourage encourage wisdom? Are
Mhm.
they recommendations? Are they hard rules? Like, what are you thinking in that vein?
I think it could be both. So here's a policy example. So this is in our use and repair section, so going a little bit further down the kind of consumption stream, where we said, look, people who are wiser really want to take responsibility for the consumption decisions that they make. And so manufacturers should support products over their lifespan, right? They shouldn't be doing things like using components that have planned obsolescence or that are proprietary, such that consumers find it difficult to repair the product or substitute other items for it. And so an example is Apple's Lightning port that's on the bottom of the iPhones that many of us have, right? It's a proprietary standard, and every time you want to buy a new accessory, you have to buy a Lightning accessory, whether it be a cable or whatever to plug in the bottom of your phone. The European Union recently adopted a regulation saying that any mobile phone that's sold in the European Union must conform to the USB-C standard for a charging receptacle. And so you'll notice the iPhone 15 just launched with a USB-C plug on the bottom of it. And so that's an example of, in our view, an effective policy intervention to try to encourage wiser behavior, because now consumers don't need to buy a separate cable for their phone, separate cable for their laptop, et cetera, generating a whole bunch of electronic waste. And so sometimes it's going to be things like that where we force manufacturers to do something. Sometimes there are going to be programs, I think, where it's a more persuasive type of argument, where we're demonstrating that it's in people's best interest because it leads to a long-term relationship, et cetera.
Real quick, just to interrupt here. If we have questions, can we pass the microphone around? They can't hear the audience when we ask questions. Thank you.
And then kind of going to the last stage of the value chain in terms of what happens when we find it time to get rid of something. We can do things like encouraging consumers to close the loop between selling products and recovering them for use again in the system by doing things like what Marks and Spencer did. They're a retailer in the UK. They provided opportunities for consumers to drop off used clothing, provided rewards as an incentive for them to do so, again, to try to ensure that those raw materials are reused. And so the argument that we tried to make in this paper was that developing consumer wisdom costs time, it costs money, it costs effort, and it's difficult. But you should think about it as an investment, as a way to build relationships with consumers. And to the extent that we can avoid kind of short-term thinking, the better. I think we're all off. Any questions? Any other questions about that paper?
Yeah. I was just wondering, where would like consumer recycling to other consumers be put? So I know, for instance, like Facebook Marketplace, you can get, if someone's gonna throw out their dresser, someone might just like I've had friends drive to pick up like a dresser for free instead of buying it.
Yeah, totally.
Would that fit in like the recycling of the model, or would that be like a different adjunct?
Yeah, exactly. I think here would be a great place to think about that kind of thing. So like Patagonia is another example where they provide a platform actually for consumers to donate used clothing. They fix it up and then they sell it again to consumers as lightly used clothing materials. And so we can think about opportunities like that, whether they be through third parties like Facebook or Craigslist or whatever, or sometimes through the manufacturers themselves. Apple's refurbished program is another one where we're not throwing these raw materials into a landfill, we're providing opportunities for consumers to extend the use of these materials.
I had a question about.
Sure.
I had a question about the consumers in general. I'm not entirely clear on how big of a maybe problem you see this as. If that could be more defined as who is the target for the consumer wisdom? Is it consumers, everybody? Is that an assumption that nobody's wise as a consumer, or is it a smaller population, or who is this kind of geared at? Because I don't know how many consumers are actually thinking, I want to be a wiser consumer, and are just going about their day
just buying kilts randomly on Amazon?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a spectrum, just like if we think about kind of wisdom in a general sense. I mean, as we talked about, we're all consumers, right? And we're all people. And so in this context, I agree that people may not necessarily be thinking, yes, I would like to wake up today and be wise. But they are engaging in behaviors on a daily basis, even things like, do I take a plastic cup when I go and get some water or coffee, or do I take a reusable cup, right? To the extent that we can make these decisions intentional and aligned with the principles of wisdom, I think that's a route for us to potentially increase well-being. So yeah, I don't think the objective should necessarily be to get people to think of themselves as wise, but to enact decisions on a relatively daily basis without, really thinking about it too much, to establish good habits. Sure.
I pushed a button on the bottom. I messed it up. I'm not sure.
So, I know this is something that you touched on in one of your papers, but I thought it was relevant here because you gave the plastic cup and water example. Is there a difference between just being a mindful consumer and being a wise consumer?
How are you defining mindful?
I mean, just thinking about what it is you're about to do, right? Like, I did the same thing. I took one of these paper cups instead of running up to the 4th floor and grabbing my mug. Now that it's been brought to attention, I kind of feel like I should have run up to the 4th floor. But, I mean, usually, people think about being mindful as just being in the present moment. So maybe if I would have thought about it instead of just thinking about, oh, there's coffee, let me get coffee, as opposed to, trying to be wise about my choices.
Mm-hmm.
I
mean, I think we're speaking on a definitional level here in terms of how do we kind of enable the constellation of behaviors that are wrapped up in what we typically think about as wisdom. And being present and being in the moment and kind of being intentional is part of that. But also part of that is thinking about how do I know kind of what goals to pursue? How do I transcend myself to think about others and across time? And so to the extent that we can kind of bring in as many of those behaviors as possible, I think that's the goal.
Did you want me to see if anybody online had any
Sure.
questions now or wait till the end?
Either's good.
I'm happy to ask a question. Well, I'm struck with how there's a cost to wisdom.
Yep.
How much of this devolves into a luxury? As in, I have the luxury to be wise.
Mm-hmm.
I can see, obviously, you can use the recycling thing to get around the cost, but sometimes all you have is the plastic cup, and
Yep.
it costs too much to buy the long-term solution that avoids the plastic cup. And I'm just wondering, what do you have to say about that? Like, do we need to have economic models that show in the long run that the reason why this is wise is that there's a long-term benefit? And how do we, do we want to have the producers bear some brunt of these luxury costs up front to produce the sustainable thing that will ultimately lead to us all benefiting?
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful point, right? Like if we think about barriers that stand in the way of individuals being able to enact these wiser behaviors, one of them is people might just not think about it. Right? Another is people might think about it but not have the ability to do it because you're right, there are constraints upon all of us, economic, time, etc. And so that's part of the reason why I think kind of bringing in organizations and policymakers is important, because often they do have the capacity to enable situations or remove some of those constraints. So if we think about things like bottle return laws, such that you pay a deposit on a product when you buy it, and then you get that deposit back when you return it as an incentive to return that raw material back to the cycle rather than throwing it out. But I think you're absolutely right that there's a cost to everything, and so trying to put those conditions in place at kind of levels that are not just at the individual level but also at the organizational level is helpful.
I do have a question. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but so Pete Miller's in the audience, and he asks, to what extent is the focus on consumer wisdom and individual behavior a distraction from organizing to require social policies that require less destructive production, transportation, etc.? And his example is like recycling glass bottles is largely a tactic to prevent people demanding reuse and refilling of bottles.
And sorry, the question was to what extent is?
He's focusing on consumer wisdom and individual behavior, just kind of like a distraction from actually like, requiring the social policies that we need.
I think for us to reach an optimal point, it has to be both an individual and an organizational and a societal level initiative. And, just like with any goal, if we have some of the people participating, we can get part of the way. But the more engagement that we have at various levels, the more likely it is that behaviors that we want are going to be carried out and encouraged. And so this is part of the reason why we were excited about this paper, was most of the work has been at the individual level. And whether we're able to convince policymakers and able to convince firms to kind of buy into this idea that it's worth the cost to enact policies and marketplace actions to encourage wisdom is up for question. But at least we're having a discussion about whether it's something to do, right?
Is there evidence that it's worth it for them, for the companies? I mean, if you look, there's no question that we overconsume. I overconsume. Everybody I know overconsumes. There's so much junk that we'll be delighted to get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll be mountains of, useless things that we don't need. If this goes away because we stop overconsuming, a lot of companies will go out of business, or at least will be minimized. So is there evidence that doing what you say will actually benefit them in the long run? Of course, in the short run, it's not. But what is the evidence that if I were a CEO, I would say, show me that in the long run, I will benefit from it, or at least not lose.
I don't have evidence, but I would love to collect evidence. I mean, to me, that's the next step in terms of thinking about how can we demonstrate empirically that there are ways to persuade organizations to adopt this type of thinking. This was a first step in terms of laying out a conceptual framework. But yeah,
But is there even an in-principle way of collecting such evidence?
I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I'd love to hear suggestions.
So I think this falls, so Sendil Mulanathan once raised, he's an economist here in the business school, he raised the concept of institutional wisdom.
Okay.
And he was thinking largely, I believe, about nudge policies. And indeed, when you look at nudge policies, which are institutional forms intended to bias the behavior of the constituents of the institutions to behave in their own best interests. So it could be used for ill, but if it's used for good, improving the adherence to a savings plan, for example, and using behavioral methods, one could imagine that indeed for some companies there will be benefits. That is, companies themselves are more sustainable, predictable, have known profit, et cetera. Other companies that don't engage won't. But as with nudge policies, some people conform and save more, and some people opt out and want to keep their organs or whatever.
Sure.
So I think the issue seems to, and also in the framing that you had with this structural diagram, fall not on the side of the consumer, as you're saying. It's really falls to sort of an institutional framing, either at the level of the companies or government role, to sort of put it in the best interest of companies to behave that way in some fashion. Is that something that you've thought about?
I haven't thought about the institutional wisdom perspective, so that's very useful. But I agree that kind of there needs to be systematic change at the organizational level in order for this type of a framework to move forward. Whether there are persuasive narratives in order to do that, I think is an open question.
So one of the most successful public campaigns was the campaign to stop smoking, which has permeated both legally and sort of as individual behavior, and was pushed by the NIH largely at a number of levels also. So something with recognized societal benefit can be sort of adopted by governments on the one hand, but also campaigns can be set up to put it in the best interest of companies to be engaged in certain kind of practices, which leads to competitive advantages in principle. And so I guess thinking about institutional wisdom, that is where policies actually make the constituents behave more wisely, if you will, whether those constituents are companies who themselves are making their consumers behave more wisely, or the consumers themselves, I think is an interesting concept.
Wonderful.
You say you can look historically at data.
Yeah, well, yes, historical data.
Might show that. And you might discover with cigarettes that what they do is they sell in South America instead of here, and they sell those addictive inhaled. What do you call them?
Vaping.
Vaping, yes, they are even worse. So they're doing okay, even though they were forced to by lawsuits mainly. To
Is there more of your talk?
There is. There's another paper.
Yeah, I didn't really. Yeah, but.
I mean,
We have 10 minutes.
yeah, it's an interesting discussion. Well, I'll do whatever the room prefers. I can move on to talk about the second paper, or we can
I
keep
want to
talking
see
about
data.
this one. The second paper is also conceptual. Why don't I tell you a little bit about it, because we only have a couple minutes, and then I'm happy to keep talking, whether it be via email or after this meeting. So in this second paper, we moved down from an organizational perspective down to an individual level perspective and zeroed in on a particular context, which was social media. This paper was published last year in the Journal of Consumer Affairs, and we thought it was relevant because we all spend, or most of us spend, a lot of time on social media, right? And that has positive effects potentially, and often deleterious effects on well-being. Right? Think about somebody, for example, who becomes engrossed in, let's say, political news, meets a whole bunch of people who think just like them, and develops a whole bunch of social connections in that manner, and might experience kind of drawbacks on the other side in terms of their in-person social connections. And so, again, thinking about this notion of balance, can wisdom kind of support individuals as they navigate these types of situations and influences? And again, we draw from two kind of conceptual foundations here. One is this idea of paradox, which is that sometimes things are X and not X at the same time. An example here from a paper by Mick and Fournier is about a juicer, where basically somebody purchases a juicer thinking this is going to be great, I'm going to increase my efficiency, I can have fresh juice anytime that I want, but then it becomes a pain in the neck because you have to clean it, and you're constantly throwing out all this pulp, and what the heck do I do with all this, right? And then it becomes a counter anchor. And so in this juicer example, the juicer is both efficient and not efficient at the same time. And that's different from the type of situation that we were talking about earlier, where we're making trade-offs, where something is X and Y at the same time. But paradoxes are particularly difficult to navigate. And so what we tried to do was identify a series of paradoxes in the social media literature. Second foundation that we built upon was wisdom, and a broader definition of wisdom than the last paper that I showed you, where we were focused mostly on the consumer wisdom scale. Here we focused on a number of dimensions across the literature that were relevant to the social media context. So everything from pro-social behaviors and attitudes to metacognition to flexibility, tolerance for divergent perspectives, etc. And we did a literature review to try to identify threats and opportunities to consumer well-being posed first by digital technology, and then we zeroed in on the social media context in particular and identified 3 paradoxes that we thought were particularly poignant. The first was at an individual level, whereby social media simultaneously makes people knowledgeable and misinformed. The second was at an interpersonal level, where social media engenders community, but at the same time isolation. And the third was that social media at the societal level can both promote and threaten democracy. We only have a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to go through perhaps one of these paradoxes just to give you an idea of the approach, and I'm happy to send you the paper later. So let's talk about knowledgeable and misinformed consumers. So social media has really democratized the information creation enterprise, right? Anybody can say anything that they want. And on one hand, that's fantastic because we have situations where experts, for example, or people who have unique knowledge are able to communicate that knowledge directly to others. We also have a situation where people who have knowledge that is perhaps less positive, misinformation, for example, they're also able to communicate that. And we saw that very vividly in COVID-19, right, where we have people like Caitlin Jedalina, who is an epidemiologist, putting a Substack out there that says, yeah, I'm your local epidemiologist and I can advise you on how to act in this very uncertain situation. And we have a whole bunch of other people putting out misinformation about anything related to COVID, about vaccines, about masks, about public health initiatives, all that stuff. Right? And that leads people to be simultaneously misinformed and well-informed. I just got my COVID booster last month, and I got a flu vaccine at the same time. I know exactly who made the COVID vaccine, even though I'm not an immunologist, right? And I probably have a whole bunch of misconceptions about vaccines. I have no idea who made my flu vaccine, right? As most of us probably don't. And so we have this situation where people are making decisions based on information that might not be great, even though they think they know a lot. And social media is a really potent kind of barrier to well-being in that sense, right? People have unlimited information. It often comes to them from people that they know and that they trust, friends, neighbors, etc. And there are algorithms that specifically present information that platforms know is going to stoke emotions and is going to lead to a sense of false consensus, right? And so we thought that invoking principles of wisdom that we talked about earlier, consideration of multiple perspective, the ability to regulate one's emotions, prudent reasoning, might help people to sort out this paradox. And so we made recommendations like recommender systems should be transparent, they should use customizable criteria that expose users to a range of different views. Again, whether platforms are willing to do that, up in the air. There's legislation at the European Union that encourages them to do this, right? And so we face kind of the same situation that we talked about in the same paper, where really we're trying to make as persuasive an argument as possible to stakeholders, be they consumers or be they firms or policymakers. And we'd love your thoughts on kind of how to make that argument more persuasive or other avenues that we could use in order to encourage consumer wisdom. And so other paradoxes that we talked about were community and isolation and promoting and threatening democracy. And so the reason that as well we adopted this lens of paradox and tried to take a holistic view is because all these things go together. Right? We have a diagram at the end of our paper that kind of tries to make this point for a holistic approach. And if we think about the COVID-19 context, misinformation fueled communities of people who became not just against COVID vaccines, but against vaccines in general. And you can find people who are looking for unvaxxed housing opportunities. There is an unvaxxed dating platform, like online dating platform. And to the extent that kind of parallel societies develop, now since then restrictions have been relaxed and people have calmed down a little bit, but you could imagine there being threats to kind of civil discourse, as happened in Canada. I'm Canadian, so I followed the quote-unquote trucker protest for some time. I mean, they're talking about overthrowing the government in order to try to end COVID-19 restrictions. And so to the extent that we can kind of consider things in a holistic view, I think it helps us to see a big picture. And so to finish up in our last couple of minutes, I've tried to make the case through a couple of conceptual pieces that it's useful for us to think about wisdom as a way to provide a more positive view in terms of the individual, the interpersonal, and the societal effects that our daily choices that each of us make have on ourselves and on each other. I like this quote from the Smith and Schwartz paper that talks about the rippling of moral waves from our ongoing consumer behaviors means in a most daunting and humbling way that there's always something at stake. Whether we pick the plastic cup or the reusable cup, or whether we pick a mattress or a car or anything, the information that we choose to consume. And so I think to the extent that we can persuade individuals and organizations to use wisdom as a guide, the better off we'll all be. And so I'm happy to share any of these papers with you. I'm also happy to have an ongoing conversation about avenues that we might advance this goal together. So thank you. Any questions in our last minute or so?
I have a quick comment. We don't need any more, just there's no live stream.
Okay.
I'm wondering to what degree